Hi, my name is Alark Saxena, and I am the Program Director for Yale Himalaya Initiative. I'm also a lecturer at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Today, we have our guest, Dr. Ashwini Chhatre from the Indian School of Business. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
I've been at the Indian School of Business as a public policy faculty for 2 years now, almost 2 years. I teach a variety of courses that deal with the role of government, and most recently, I taught a course on climate change and business. Definitely one of the first in India, but I suspect there are not too many others around the world. And Indian business schools have a propensity to prioritize public policy, has always historically been true. And I find that ISB, being new, is very keen to develop its public policy, both its credentials and its capacities. I have helped them accomplish some of that, and it's been a very good ride. Before that, I spent almost 8 years as a faculty member in the Department of Geography at the University of Illinois.
Okay.
And I have had a meandering journey, starting as an economist, working for almost 10 years as an activist and social organizer, a PhD in political science, a postdoctoral fellowship in sustainability science, which was very new at that time, and then tenure in geography, finally ending up in public policy.
Very interesting. What got you interested in the Himalayas?
You mean everyone is not interested in the Himalayas? Well, I'm more interested than a few others. I spent 4 years in Shimla as a child when my father was posted there as part of his government service.
Okay.
And I have very fond memories of Shimla, which unfortunately is a town that has been destroyed by urban sprawl and many bad things. So it was one of the geographical areas that I would have always wanted to go back. And I did.
Which we all do. I mean, it's the same thing with me. As a child, I was sent to these trekking camps up in the Himalayas, and that just
It calls you.
Yeah, it definitely calls you. You were talking about climate change specifically. Tell us a little bit more about your work on climate change, and specifically if there was anything on Himalayas.
So I've been working on climate change and other things in the Himalayas since about 1995, before people started talking about climate change. Although I have been careful and continue to be careful to not sort of try to call it exclusively climate change. There are so many other things going on, and we need to be very careful, both in terms of attribution and in terms of our own blinkers that prevent us from seeing other things or attribute things to climate change where a more reasonable explanation exists. One of the earliest instances I saw of the disconnect between official discourse, including science, and how climate change was experienced in the daily lives of people, or in actually livelihoods and decision making, which is most important, was about the growing of wheat in the higher reaches of the Himalayas. Wheat is a very old crop in the Himalayas, actually. It's older than Punjab. Punjab is new to wheat.
I see.
But Himalayan wheat is very different. It's adapted to being buried under snow for 2 to 3 months.
Right.
So farmers sow wheat in November, it germinates, and then stays under snow for 3 months, 2 to 3 months depending on altitude. And when the snow melts, it uses, because it's on terraces, it uses snow melt to shoot up. Within 3 weeks, it gets back to where the wheat in Punjab is, which was sown at around the same time. It's uniquely adapted. And of course, it's not a natural adaptation process. It's a process of plant breeding, and I mean, farmers have contributed immensely to these kind of mutual adaptation selection processes. And what I saw was that because of all kinds of warming experiences, the wheat that was supposed to be buried under snow and was adapted to be buried under snow was unable to deliver because the snow was not staying on the ground for long. Either it was delayed or it used to melt in January. So the ground was snow free for several days occasionally. And the snow melt would actually rot the plants instead of allowing them to grow because the temperature was still close to freezing. This is the kind of climate impacts that climate science or climate policy is actually incapable of even hearing.
So in that sense, I want to broaden the question a little bit. And the question is, in terms of the geographic extent, the number of, what's the total population that's cultivating wheat in the Himalayan region that you're working in, what you think is getting affected by this? And then if they are getting affected, have you seen, apart from the divide between the public policy and the actual issue, have you seen people taking active or proactive steps towards negotiating with these change?
So I didn't say there's a disconnect between this issue and public policy. There's a disconnect between this issue and climate policy. Or climate science and climate policy.
Sorry.
My guess is there would be a few million people across the Himalayas that are growing wheat in the middle regions who's likely to be affected or already affected and adapted and doing other things, and we are going to lose that wheat. But I think the wheat example should be seen metaphorically. It's not just about wheat, because in other places there will be other crops that are more uniquely adapted and outside the ambit of our lens of vulnerability or adaptation or adaptation or whatever we want to look at. In fact, so there's another example. There's the Beas Valley, especially the upper reaches. It sort of perfect geographical example because it comes straight down north-south from Rohtang all the way to Pundoha. So where it hits the reservoir. In the mid-1980s, the lower reaches of that part of Beas, the Takoli, Nagwai, Bajora region, on the border of Mandi and Kullu districts, was the core apple production zone. That is where you would see great piles of apples and stacks of wooden crates, trucks and traffic jams in the mid-1980s. Now there is no apple grown there. It's commercially unviable because it's too hot. And the core apple growing zone has shifted 80 kilometers to the north of Kullu, between Kullu and Manali near Nagar. And almost 1,500 feet higher. Right? So if you step back and think about it for a moment, all those farmers who were, I have data from household studies that were conducted then, 85% of 85% of household income came from apple. And apple is unviable now. What happened to those farmers? What happened to their livelihoods?
Exactly.
When I go back and I'm doing a intense study of two panchayats, Nagwai and Takoli, what I find that the farmers are actually better off than they were. They are growing 17 different kinds of vegetables. Average number of vegetables that a farmer grows is more than 4.
Wow.
And there is a suite of public, private and civic institutions that are connected in a network with flows of information, resources and influence that these farmers can access. That has enabled them to make this transition.
Very interesting.
Of course, it's also enabled by the rapid urban development that has happened in the plains. So Delhi, Ludhiana, Yamunanagar, Jalandhar, Chandigarh, everyone is eating more green vegetables. And these farmers are at the edge of a national highway that connects to all these cities. And they were already exporting apples in trucks.
So they were pretty much well adapted to shifting from one crop to the other.
And public policy was in place to help them do that through institutions to which the farmers had access.
Excellent. So in some ways, what you're pointing me is this could almost be seen as a very successful example of things coming together. Maybe it was not done deliberately.
It was absolute. Nobody was doing this because of climate change.
Nobody was doing it for climate change. But in some ways, this kind of responds to the idea of development or sustainable development and how certain path dependencies can allow some communities to do much better off than others. And this kind of goes to the question of not sure how many of these communities so maybe it's a question to you. Within these groups, were there people who still lost versus some who gained significantly?
Believe me, I have looked. There aren't any. It's a surprise to me as well because there are usually winners and losers.
Right.
And at all scales. So within Nagwai, for example, everyone has benefited.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even across the valley, apple is being grown now where it was not being grown.
Right.
And that is not because of climate change, it's because of better infrastructure. Right? So the apple market is also increasing, but it's not at the same rate. But it's not that people are eating less apples. So there is still need for more apples or demand for more apples, although a lot of it is coming from New Zealand and China and Western Washington and so on. But still, apple growers have a steady market. And new apple growers are coming online in the upper reaches of the Kulu Valley. And of course, they are not now able to grow apples because of climate change. They were always able to grow apples. Their main constraint was infrastructure, roads, trucks. Now they have that.
Right.
So people who were not part of the apple economy are now benefiting from the apple economy. People who are no longer able to benefit from the apple economy are benefiting from the vegetable economy.
Beautiful. So in that sense, even if we look at it more from a climate perspective, as the gradient varies of temperature and it's moving up, it has provided benefits in coordination with improved infrastructure. Many other possibilities are now.
The choices are greater.
Choices are greater. And so this leads me to a next kind of question, which is, again, kind of widening up. What are the major, maybe even shift back, I think the question is, Himalaya has been seen as this landscape of drastic shifts or changes now. And rapid is the word that gets used for most of these things. What changes have you seen, apart from, for example, you mentioned climate change as something that you've studied. What other shifts have you seen in the landscape that you're working on that really are stark?
Cash crop economy, a scaling back of the remittance economy. So remember 20 years ago, 30 years ago, Himalayas was a remittance economy. People would, its major export was labor, cheap labor. Household labor, manual labor, maids, all kinds of stuff, drivers. There were some people who went out as bureaucrats, but very small proportion. And of course, all these people sent money back and sort of the resultant feminization of labor and so on and so forth. Of course, it was not universally equally intensive. Some people, some places, some areas exported more people than others. But that is how Pahadis were known in the plains, is that people who come from the mountains to work. That has changed. The remittance economy is not the primary driver. The cash crop economy is. So the major exports are no longer people. And remittances are no longer a major source of income for even a minority of people.
Really?
It's the cash crop economy that has generated incomes, and fairly broad-based incomes.
Do you think, just as you were talking about, that the shift and the accessibility as it changed and the remoteness is reduced, that some of these patterns get shifted to higher altitudes? So in places that might have been much harder for somebody to come out of the valleys to even participate in labor economy earlier, now because of accessibility, now they are in that phase, while these people who have been part of the labor economy have now moved on to to the cash crop economy. Do you think that's a shift?
It's possible to think of it that way. I like to think of it primarily as driven by the expanding economy. the numbers are, it's just mind-boggling. The amount of vegetables that urban India is buying and consuming is 1,000 times more than just 10 years ago. The number of fresh vegetables that are available across season. And so places like Himachal Pradesh, but not just Himachal Pradesh, but places like Himachal Pradesh that I know well, and parts within that were leaders in that shift, in that trend. Remote valleys in Mandi, Ul, right? It's supposed to be very far from everywhere, and they are very difficult to get there even now, even today, even with the roads and so on. They are producing cauliflower, and they are able to sell that. It's sort of 6,000 to 7,000 feet above sea level. So they are able to produce and market their cauliflower at a time when there is no other cauliflower in the market. So they get a 700% premium.
Wow.
There are traders who are paying them 100 rupees a kilo at the farm gate.
That's pretty amazing.
That farmers in Punjab can only dream about.
Yeah, certainly. That's fascinating. That brings me to another interesting question, which we talked about, the issue of path dependence, one, and how path dependence can be seen, can be used for your own benefit. And so, Uttarakhand declaring itself as a completely organic state, or Sikkim saying...
Sikkim did that.
Uttarakhand, I think the policy was...
Yeah. There is a desire.
But it hasn't happened. Do you think that that's something that, in terms of greening the economy or green economy model, that these spaces can actually benefit from, or has there been any movement on that in the places you're studying?
No, I don't know a lot about Sikkim. So it's difficult for me to comment on that, but definitely in the western parts that I know well, and parts of Nepal that I've worked in, this is just simply not a viable medium in at any scale, really. So I don't see how farmers in Sikkim are actually going to benefit unless the market for organic produce increases exponentially in the future, and I don't see that happening. It's still a niche market.
Well, yes, it's a niche market. One of the things is that if you haven't, either because of remoteness or lack of infrastructure, and in some ways, or by choice, people were not able to use the existing market-based products in terms of pesticides or fertilizers. So now that there is this kind of push towards going back or removing these kind of chemical-based products, some states are just better off partly because they never were on the bandwagon of using
it's a default organic.
Right. So they were default organic, which is great. So do you think that is that something that's happening, or you don't think that?
I haven't seen it, and I'm glad. So I'm not a fan of organic. I eat organic vegetables, and I will pay a premium for that. But as a development strategy, I think we need to distinguish between pesticides that are really bad and fertilizers which are often necessary in poor soils. So we need to be judicious about fertilizers, and we need to shun pesticides. But organic is too blunt. It makes no distinctions. It brooks no opposition. Says everything is bad. And farmers are far more reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, in most parts of the world, farmers are less interested in the marketing idea of what it is, but rather than the product.
What works.
Yeah. So that's great. I'm going to shift a little bit of the questions. You've also worked on you're working currently on some historical ideas of environment democracy in the Himalayas. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I believe that property rights and political competition help us understand a lot of what we see today. And you could say that this is arrogance or hubris. They have definitely helped me understand situations much better. And the only way to see how property rights and political competition help us understand the present is by going as far back as possible or as is meaningful. Because property rights do not exist in a vacuum, and they definitely did not, they definitely evolved over time. So my own work looks at the relationships between environment, development, and democracy as feeding into each other across scale. And I use these two lenses, how property rights have evolved and how political competition has evolved, given the rules of the game, which themselves have changed.
How would you define political competition?
It's basically organized groups that are trying to vie for power under a set rule. Under a set of rules.
Got it. Okay.
Could be constitution, but it was the Government of India Act for the 1935 elections, for example.
Okay.
With proportional representation or separate electorates and all kinds of other rules that were abandoned in 1950. But there was a set of rules within which the Communist Party and the Congress Party and the Unionist Party and the Muslim League were fighting for power at the state legislature.
Okay. And so what have you found, or what's going on in that work?
I think for me, the most interesting insight is that the constitution of property rights, sometime in the late 19th century, for example, in most parts of colonial Punjab where I work, is driven by the prevailing political economy. So if the prevailing political economy is that of acquiring timber for Royal Navy and for the expansion of railways, you get a certain kinds of property rights that then cast a very long shadow on how development, how democracy, how environmental issues play themselves out 100 years later.
Interesting. And so have you found any aspects that have come out in this long span which show that this is how it kind of transformed the debate?
You will have to read my book in order to do that, which I am yet to write.
Yeah.
So it may be a long wait. But yes, so property rights in Kullu, for example, that were driven largely by the political economy of timber, led to patterns of political competition that are more clientelistic. Compared to Kangra, where it was more the political economy of irrigation, or trying to protect investments in irrigation in Punjab, with a greater focus on private property and agricultural revenue, led to very different kinds of patterns of development that are less clientelistic and more democratic.
Very interesting. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Don't hold your breath.
Some of your work on forestry issues, what have you been working on that?
There are two scales at which I work. One is a global level, where I'm part of this network of researchers called International Forestry Resources and Institutions. It's started by Lynn Ostrom and colleagues at Indiana and is now headquartered in Michigan. We are sort of in the process of a transition where IFRI will move to the Indian School of Business, where I will be coordinating it globally. That work primarily looks at the common property regime framework and trying to address some of the hypotheses that are either untested quantitatively on a large global data set, or a process of discovery in terms of relationships between livelihoods, environmental outcomes, and the institutions that govern forests. So a lot of my work has been using data collected under the IFRI program across multiple countries, 3 continents, and so on. The other work is more Himalayan-based, Himachal Pradesh-based. One of which, for example, is looking at the impact of eco-development kind of programs on environment and development. And how do these programs work on the intrinsic motivations of people to protect the environment?
Very interesting.
And that is Himachal based and sort of tries to locate it within that history that I'm talking about. So we take the evolution of property rights into account in terms of understanding how people relate to forests, not just in terms of their rights, but also in terms of their intrinsic motivations to protect forests, as well as locating it within the context of development in terms of what are their livelihood opportunities, what are their current assets and opportunities, and what are their aspirations. What we find, somewhat unfortunately, is that the interventions that we are evaluating across, so we have a large data set, 2,000 households, multiple time periods, households we have been following for 10 years now. And some of it has been published. There's one recent article in American Political Science Review. We find that when compared to households in control villages, the impact of eco-development programs on households in project villages is really bad. We basically crowd out their intrinsic motivations by providing material benefits. And this is a well-known finding in economics. People have been doing that for 30 years. But the people who design sustainable development interventions or eco-development or whatever do not read that literature. So we keep throwing sort of small bones at people, hoping to change their behavior without actually noticing that we are changing their behavior in the other direction.
That's a very interesting find. And have you come across solutions or kind of pathways around it?
In our research, we found that the impact of private material benefits is negative. The impact of collective material benefits is positive. So where people collectively worked on a common asset, like an irrigation project or a road or a plantation, their motivations to protect forest improved. And their behavior also improved. Where they were given private material incentives, their intrinsic motivations were crowded out.
And so, but again, the problem of collective action, how does this come about in terms of their positive, what explains their positive motivation to protect a common property?
We don't know. We are still trying to find out.
That's a great question.
Something that should be left for the future.
Yeah. Well, this has been very helpful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.